Jeff Clothing here. I'm a managing director with L.E.K's packaging and industrials practice, and I'm excited to dive into our third day of the virtual conference on the future of packaging. This year's conference is taking place as a series of 90-minute events over the course of 4 days. On day one, last Tuesday, we had a lively discussion about mergers and acquisitions in the packaging sector. On day two, last Thursday, we dedicated that to strategies on how brand owners are meeting their sustainability goals for packaging. Today, on day three, we're going to spend some time talking about meeting packaging sustainability goals in the context of a recycling infrastructure crisis. On day four, which is Thursday of this week, our topic will be packaging innovation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me just firstly say how much I appreciate your willingness to pivot to an online format this year. And I'm so glad that you could, because we have a great agenda here today. We're going to focus on the recycling infrastructure crisis, in particular, how the packaging industry is stepping up to meet the demands of brand owners against this backdrop. But first, I want to pause and run you through a couple of housekeeping items for those of you that are just now tuning in. Firstly, feel free to join us in the conversations. Please submit questions through the Q&A tool on your screen. We'll do our best to have the panelists respond at the end of the event here today. And submitted questions are only going to be seen by the conference organizers. So please let us know what you'd like to hear our distinguished panelists here address. We'd also like to encourage you to connect with fellow attendees by using the chat feature. Schedule meetings, joining the lounge for continued conversation after the panel event here. If you need any support whatsoever with the conference platform, please reach out to Brittany Norton or Megan Donavos. All 4 sessions are going to be recorded and then also shared with registrants at the end of the event. Now, here's what to expect for today's event. We'll start off with a keynote address. After that, we'll have our panel discussion, and then we'll have Q&A to the extent that we have time. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker here, Tamsin Ettefagh. She is a Chief Sustainability Officer at PureCycle Technologies. She has 33 years of experience in the areas of recycling, and particularly in plastics recycling. And her work has ranged from implementing a recycling collection program to running the recycling operations for a MRF, to purchasing raw materials for plastic recycling companies, to selling recycled resins for plastic recycling companies. Tamsin has also advised agencies, banks, and potential plastics manufacturers on market conditions, supply types, and ways to evolve and diversify markets for recycled resins. Tamsin is going to talk to us about the circular economy and what it will take to achieve it. She'll give us her thoughts on plastic waste management, then take us on a tour of some of the most cutting-edge packaging innovations that are underway right now. Please join me in welcoming Tamsin.
Thank you for that, Jeff. I appreciate it. So I'm going to go in and share my screen, right, so that I can get you guys loaded up with my presentation. And here we go. Thank you, guys. And I'm Tamsin Ettefagh, as Jeff mentioned, Chief Sustainability Officer for PureCycle Technologies. But a little bit more about me: I'm a mother of 4 and a grandmother of 5, so I like to brag about that more than my 33 years. And those that know me know I'm very outspoken on the subject of sustainability and in particular plastics recycling. And at the end of my speech, I'm going to give a little 1-minute commercial on PureCycle Technologies so I can justify my presence here with you guys today. And because I am a grandmother, I'm going to put on my glasses so I can see. So let's start out with sustainability. It comes from the Latin word sustenere, which means to maintain and endure. I'm trying to get you guys in the mindset of truly sustainability is really about breaking away from the linear system that we have today, which just exacerbates the problem that we have. We all know single serve packaging is under attack in today's format of a linear system. It is not sustainable, okay? We've got the UN, who have many countries, including the United States, have joined Sustainable Development Goals. And, you know, I encourage all of you guys to go onto their website and look at these more closely. But if I were to target some of the numbers, there's at least 10 of them that kind of the packaging industry can have an impact on. So that's why I highly encourage you. This is a global event, and we need to work together and collaborate to get there. So if I think about the past and I think about, you know, going back into the 80s and 90s where I started, you know, we were on a roller coaster up and down. Sustainability's cool, sustainability's not. But really what came to an impact in my mind that moved the needle and made a difference and created a lot of attention was at the start of 2010. I was kind of blessed that one of my customers, which was a CPG, brought to me this Vision 2050 report that I read, and I was just blown away in reading it. And then it basically talked about, if we keep consuming at the rate we were in 2010, which unfortunately we're consuming more now, so we didn't reduce, but if we keep consuming at that rate, the earth is only going to be able to supply us the means for all the products that we produce at 2.3 times what the earth can produce. So we can't sustain that, right? We can't continue to consume at that level. So that was kind of the first one. The second one was an article came out in Science magazine talking about the ocean waste issue, co-authored by Jenna Jambak, and it kind of illuminated that 80% of this material that's ending up in the ocean, and we're talking all packaging, not just plastics, but plastics float, are land-based. And out of that land-based, about 90% of it was coming out of Southeast Asia. And so when you think about, you know, kind of our recycling infrastructure at the time, which I'll talk about in a minute, you can kind of understand why after that, you started to see things like the Chinese fence in 2013, the evolution of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and starting the circular economy, and quite frankly, the closed loop fund, which you're going to hear Maite Quinn talk about, all kind of evolve in 2016. And then we had a video or a documentary that came out into one of the festivals that was called Plastics China, which is a bigger dig over the amount of waste that we were shipping from other countries to China. And so they put up their announcement in 2017 that they were going to cut off all the commodities from other countries coming into Asia. And that was really when it put us all in sticker shock in regards to the markets for the commodities we were collecting at curbside at the time. Then in 2018, we had Ellen MacArthur Foundation announce the new plastics economy. That's when we started to see plastics packs starting all over the country, all over the world, starting out with the UK first. And in 2020, we implemented the US Plastics Pact. So when we go to the US Plastics Pact and we look at what their targets are, and we have over 100, I think just at 100 members today, these targets are, first, it's kind of an ugly one, is defining the list of plastic packaging that's unnecessary. And to do that in this year, and then make 100% of the packaging that we have out there today either recyclable or compostable by 2025. Then we're going to take on ambitious goals to get recycling and composting at 50% by 2025. And then the next goal is to get an average of 30% recycled content or responsibly bio-based resins by 2025. So these are the goals of the US Plastics Pact. And so if you think about them right now, defining the list of packaging that's pragmatic, you might want to have a seat at the table for that. I brought up the European goals because they've already implemented some extended producer responsibility laws that is really putting a large amount of demand on the commodities we produce today in the United States for collection for recycling. And so you might question, why is everything going up? Well, part of it is some of the goals that consumer product companies have made, especially under the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the new plastic circular economy, but it's also some of the goals that other countries have made, and maybe they haven't got the specific stream of materials to be collected to go back into the infrastructure to meet their goals. And so we're seeing a lot of pull, and particularly in food packaging, so that it can meet the needs of being food grade material again. And this is very similar to what we have in the US under RCRA. We expanded RCRA's legislation in 1971 to incorporate landfill diversion goals. Ours are not as ambitious as this, except for California. Most of our states have a goal of diversion of 25% versus the 65%, which Europe has by 2035. They've also got landfill diversion of specific materials, and I'm starting to see EPR legislation show up in our legislature in several states for things like textiles and carpet and things like that. So when we think about supply in technologies, there might be an opportunity for some of this to enter the packaging stream, and I'll talk about that in a few. So how many recycling programs are there out there in the United States? And can we recycle our way out of them? Well, here's the sticker shock. There's 20,000 independent municipal RAN systems, which means there's 21,000 different decisions being made on what we recycle and how we recycle it. And so that makes it very confusing for the consumer as to what do they put in the bin, especially when they travel. They get to a hotel, does the hotel recycle what I have in my hotel room? If I go move from, let's say, San Francisco, that takes a lot more different commodities, to a place like Montgomery, Alabama, where they only take some very specific commodities, it's got to be frustrating when you're in the habit of putting that in the recycling bin. So organizations like Closed Loop and the Recycling Partnership and many magazines have all been talking about recycling is broken. And, you know, when you really look at it, these MRFs were built to kind of answer the need of RCRA's expansion of landfill diversion in 1991. And they kind of started implementing curbside recycling programs in the late 80s. And they were designed around the packaging that we had and that we were disposing of at the time. So there were really 7 key items that we attributed to being large critical mass that we could recycle. And that included paper, cardboard, aluminum, tin, glass, which has taken a step backwards recently with many of the programs not accepting glass because of the economics, to just PET and HDPE bottles only. And then you fast forward about 15 years and single serve or single stream recycling kind of took place. It kind of opened the door to talk about all bottles getting recycled. And really that created a lot of wish cycling. So a lot of people contributed other modes of packaging that they could see the chasing arrows and made assumptions that that meant if I put it in the bin, it would get recycled. And so if you think about that, back in the early 2000s when single stream got started and all those other materials like thermoforms and flexible packages showing up at the curbside, you can understand we really didn't address it as a problem because China was willing to take it. And so that's when we started to look at, oh my goodness, they're putting up the fence and now they're putting up the sword, and we can't ship these commodities over to China unless they're at 0.1% contamination or less. They've opened the door back up to if you're at 0.1 contamination. And really what that's done is slow down the capacity of what the MRFs can run at. And so I see today we're landfilling more and more than we ever did before. And sadly, it's being landfilled out of the MRF system. So it's really recycling was broken before China, if you think about it. And we really haven't revolutionized yet technically what we needed to do, but that is starting to happen. And those are some of the bullet points I'm going to bring up. But first, we have to start with the first challenge is access to recycling. There's estimates that 34 million rural homes and 16 million apartments, which represents about 40% of our population, does not have access to recycling from home. So we've got to fix that. This is kind of the zero waste hierarchy. I like to use this kind of model for what looks good, which is rethinking and redesigning for recycling. Of course, reduction is a little bit green, but not as green as redesigning, reuse, and it continues to go down to mechanical where it's kind of the yield sign color, and then advanced recycling until we get the carbon footprint to look better and keep that polymer in chain and regeneration of it and circularity in that space. Then it kind of gets a little orange, and then waste to energy kind of ends the nutrient right there at that moment in time where we just burn it off as fuel. So not so green anymore. And then, of course, managed landfilling, which is not as good as waste to energy, to mismanaged disposal, and something we have to address today in a major way, and that's the red. When I think about how we get to the consumer to make good decisions, I really wish we had a way to implement the carbon consumption of the choices that we make in our packaging. And we've got a how to recycle logo that the SPC has created. Not every packaging format has adopted that, but it's a start. It also kind of shows you in this slide how mechanical recycling compares to virgin resin manufacturing and how there's a significant savings of energy. So, you know, it's not 100% savings. Of course, that's impossible, but we can see as much as 90% savings in energy on the olefins and in the upper 70s on the polyester. And of course, there's a lot of other resins that we really haven't compared what recycling mechanically looks like against that. But that brings the chemical recycling and advanced recycling technologies that are coming into play and how they look at life cycle analysis and what can we do to improve that to make it more on the green scale of being the better attribute. So again, if you think about back in the 80s when we kind of got curbside taken off the ground, we kind of went out and created these 3 R's. Reduce, reuse, recycle. I would say, well, we got recycling up to about 1/3 of where we need to be. We haven't really done much in reuse until very recently. And we've just started to do things in reduction, like going from a bottle to a pouch, maybe in a certain format, going from a heavy weighted container to a light weighted container could be an example of how we've done reduction. But that doesn't really take us to circular. And so I was thinking about this before I came on to speak with you guys. We're really missing a bunch of R's. And so this is Tamsin Ettefagh's 10 R's to circularity. So the first one, we have to be responsible. All of us in the value chain, from the consumer making purchasing decisions to the consumer product company putting out designed products that can be recovered, recoverable, and recycled. So we've got to redesign to get to that recoverable and recyclable format, right? And when I say recyclable, you know, everything on earth is recyclable, but not everything is economical to recycle. So either we've got to be part of the responsibility to make sure that what could be recycled is recycled and have an investment in it, or we've got to say this isn't the right product for the format that we're delivering. We've got to remove all the unnecessary materials. And when I talk about that, there's a soap that I used to buy that had 7 layers of packaging. I reached out to the 1-800 number, and I'm not going to name the company, and said, please, why so much packaging? Let's reduce that. And I didn't see them do it, so I'm no longer a customer of that package. And I love the product, so that makes me really sad. Again, we've got to make our products recyclable, and we have to recycle them. And with that, we have to create markets. So we have to be part of that demand. And so recycled content is an imperative part of creating the circularity. And, you know, there are going to be some formats that can't be recycled mechanically. So I kind of look at advanced recycling technology as a way to regeneratively package those packages. And that doesn't mean to burn them off for fuel, but it really means to consume them back into a format that they can be regenerated back into the cycle. And a huge part of what we're missing today is reward. We can talk about incentives to the consumer being financial, or incentives to the CPGs to be financial in what decisions we make. But it can be as simple as making it simpler for consumers to recycle. That can be a reward in itself. So if we all kind of cooperate together to make sure all the different formats are recyclable, and we make it so that they can all put the recyclables that are recyclable into the bin, including thermoforms, including injection molded containers, including glass containers again, that's a reward to the consumer, especially when that's what they're wanting and asking for today. And if we can't fix circularity with the first 9 R's, then God help us, regulation has to come into play. The only benefit of regulation is it kind of levels the playing field as long as that regulation is formatted across, let's say, all single serve packaging and not just centric to like beverages or cutlery or straws or something specific like that. So we can also look at how doing something good without looking at the whole, which means the whole value chain, is not really sustaining it. And an example I'd like to give that's not in the packaging format is like going out and buying an electric car. You know, good, you're not using so much petroleum product. That's a good thing, right? But not if you have to go and charge your car with electricity that comes from coal that we have to ship across the globe to charge that electricity. So we really have to look at the whole entire value chain and the system. And so that's how we have to look at this packaging. You know, who are all the participants in the value chain and how can we reduce the life cycle analysis to get that circularity instituted? So the good news is investments are happening. American Chemistry announced last year that there are $5.3 billion worth of investments happening between mechanical and advanced recycling technologies in the US. I can only imagine what that means for our economy, especially after COVID, right? To see that we are making investments that way, maybe we won't crash so hard after COVID. The other good news is a couple of years ago, the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industry announced how many jobs it creates. And I can only imagine, since this report was written prior to the announcement of $5.3 billion entering the marketplace in investments, that we're only going to create more revenue into the economy, and we're only going to create more jobs. And I think that's another necessary thing, that we got to make sure whatever we do doesn't eliminate jobs, but creates jobs. So one of the first technologies I'm really excited about, I know that it's an investment Closed Loop has made into, and I want us to think about the value beyond sorting in the MRF that this brings. That very first scanning system, which gives you the picture in the center, illuminates everything that's on that conveyor that comes into curbside recycling, and it identifies it. And you can see there's some thermoforms in there, there's some flexibles, there's different formats of paper packaging, and there's different formats of durable goods like a cup. And with AMP Robotics data mining all this material, it really leads to investment when we start to see that there's critical mass of particular things being put into the bin. So that's the first step. It also tells us what's not being put into the bin. And if we are making that product, how do we articulate it and create a demand for that product so that it enters the bin of municipal recycling? And then last but not least, it uses robotic arms at the end of the day. And if you think about picking up waste, this is one of those jobs that's really hard to keep staffed at a recycling center or a MRF, and the robot shows up to work every day. So I'm kind of excited that the technology is evolving so that we don't have situations, which has really opened our eyes during COVID, of people not showing up to work, us not being able to process the materials that show up at curbside, and a huge influx of landfillings going on just at the cuspis of us trying to create more demand in recycling. This is a innovation in packaging where we're actually using the package itself as another use. So I look at this as reusing, but I really like the interactive part of the package itself communicating to the consumer. So I want us to think outside the box of packaging design people of how we can innovate and communicate on our packaging to the consumer about what the next life is for that package. I mentioned reusable as being part of the circular economy. And so this creates both a reduction in consumption and a reuse on those 10 R's I talked about. This was just launched about 3 weeks ago. It has a URL code that has been experimented with that can last up to 100 times before it fades away, and that the consumer can't scan it under a URL scanning system. So they pay a deposit in advance at Starbucks. They use the reusable cup. When they bring it back to a kiosk or mail it back into the format that Starbucks is looking at creating, then they get credit and that deposit's taken off their credit card. So this is an example of interactive and reusable. I like this package being made out of algae because it's a outside of the box way of making something, a format. But the question I have, is it edible? Is it compostable? Is it recyclable? Will it contaminate the recycling stream? And I'm not trying to throw this particular candy under the bus because it might come in a box that has that communication. But I just, again, want you to think about how do we communicate to the consumers about the packaging we're producing and the products that we're selling. This is a really more innovative packaging. And I know that we've got a panelist on this about food, and I'm sure food waste is going to come into play when it comes to packaging. So I really love this because it tells the consumer that, hey, guess what? Your steak might not be good if you don't cook it today, and maybe we'll have less food waste. And again, it's that type of interactive packaging that I'd love to see us use in how we present what LCAs are for the packaging or what the consumer can do with the packaging afterwards. So think interactive. Here's another interactive format that's reuse. And what I really like about it is a format that helps eliminate some of the really small sachets that we've heard so many negative things about. I'm not trying to put sachets out of business, but again, it's an outside of the box way of thinking. And you're probably thinking, yeah, how are these third world countries where we're producing sachets where we can sell a product for a lot less cost because we're selling a lot less volume? How are they going to have phones? So this particular program that Algramo is running is in Chile. There's 2,500 stores that have these refillable units. People download it on their phone, the app. They buy how much they want to put in their reusable container, and they just pay for that amount. So if all they can afford is 2 ounces versus 32 ounces, they can do that. And last year in 2020, 1.7 million liters of soap was delivered in this format and sold. And according to Algramo, it was a reduction of 30% in cost. So that can be a reward either to the consumer product company that supported this format, or the packaging company that supported this format, or the consumer if we passed on that savings to the consumer, or it could be a reward for all three if it's a shared revenue savings across the three. So just food for thought. I absolutely love this one as someone who used to run a plastics recycling company. You know, it's going to be great for the consumer to be able to use all of their toothpaste up and not get down to the last third and try to get at least half of a toothpaste spread across the top of the toothbrush, right? Maybe even a quarter when you get down to the end. And because they had to have something that would cause it to imprint, they had to multi-layer those tubes before with foil. Now what Liquid Glide is a nanoparticle spray that goes inside the packaging prior to it being filled, that attaches to the package so that the product inside is not attaching to the package. I'm really excited to see something like butt paste use this format in their tubes. So God forbid if butt paste shows up as a recycling product in a recycling plant at a plastics company, I can't even imagine what it's going to be like to wash that out. But if they use this Liquid Glide, it might not have any of that product left in there. So I'm really excited about how this can move the needle to make tubes more attractive for recycling. It can even be something that the fill lines use between formats of loading product into products and be an easier way to clean out their systems. I think there's a lot of different uses. Think about oil bottles and the residue. And today, you know, most of those 20,000 municipalities are saying, please, no oil bottles. Maybe we can if we use some sort of format like Liquid Glide. So I'm excited about this technology. It was introduced about 10 years ago when I went to a Walmart sustainability expo. And 10 years later, I'm just seeing it commercialized. So I'm really excited about it. P&G, Guion has heard me talk about resin markers for years, and I'm so excited that he did an outside of the box thought. He met with his label manufacturers and they created a holographic way of scanning and reading formats of what the package is made out of. And so we all know there's PET bottles that might have 100% polypropylene sleeve over it. And so the scanning systems at a recycling plant might read it as being a polypropylene and kick it out. Hopefully not in the future, because I'm going to talk about PureCycle. But the other application that's really good about it is you can also tell it that is a food grade container. So food versus non-food is really important to be able to advance the needle for mechanical recyclers to be able to make a L&O grade recycled content to meet the needs of recycled content for manufacturers. So that's really exciting. So here's my 1 minute on PureCycle. I'm hoping that PureCycle is going to unlock the circular economy for polypropylene. Today, it's very linear, just like all the other formats. Unfortunately, it's a very inefficient recovery today, with less than 10% of all plastics being recycled. And the largest plastic used globally is polypropylene, and it's only recycled at 1%. It has limited end markets because it's used in so many different formats. It doesn't have that one standout critical mass product like a milk bottle or a soda pop bottle with HDP and PET. So it's kind of limited its access to recycling. And so for decades, it's gone unchecked, really unattended, and not very much pressure until recently, when different places are looking to delist polypropylene as a recyclable. So PureCycle really can't come into play quick enough. It is very similar to the traditional mechanical recycling, but instead of water to wash along with surfactant and caustic as a chemical to clean off the adhesives and the exterior contaminants, it is a way of washing with a solvent that actually removes the interior contaminants like additives and colorant, making it a purely recycled finished product that can be used in food grade applications afterwards. It gets confused to be chemical recycling because it's a solvent, but let's face it, mechanical recyclers are using chemicals too. The definition of chemical recycling is the breakdown of the molecular bonds of the plastic, and this is not what that is. It still leaves the polymer polypropylene intact while it washes away those other contaminants. And so we really look at it as a different way of purification mechanically. So this is a before and after. The far left is ground up dirty polypropylene flakes, probably some polyethylene contamination, maybe a little bit of PET and PVC and polystyrene is ground up in there. And at the end of it, that ground up flake looks like a crystal clear, almost like diamond polypropylene material afterwards. So pretty disruptive and exciting technology. We can even be a customer for some of the mechanical recyclers that maybe their technology wasn't able to handle the volume of contaminants they had. And they do an IR check afterwards and find out, oops, they've got 1% PET, or oops, they've got 15% polyethylene in their polypropylene, and their end consumer product company has problems with delamination because of polyethylene content. We could take those pellets and purify it to purely 100% polypropylene afterwards. So again, we look at it as a disruptor and hopefully a solution for helping bridge circularity on polypropylene. And I just want to thank you so much, everybody, for listening to me. This is my email address if you want to reach out to me afterwards, but feel free to ask questions at the end of this platform. I'm happy to try to answer any of them. And thank you guys for letting me talk.
Interesting insights, and really appreciate you sharing your perspectives. I think a great tour of how we got to the position that we're in currently with the state of the U.S. recycling infrastructure crisis. Really interesting comparison between some of the differences and particularly the decision-making dynamics between the U.S. with, you mentioned the 20,000 unique municipal systems decision makers relative to the decision-making dynamics in Europe. And the difference in performance across those systems. And I think lastly, really appreciate all the specific examples on unique innovations that converters collaboratively working with brand owners are being able to bring to market to help brand owners with addressing some of these big, bold 2025 goals. So thank you so much for taking us through.
Absolutely.
Would like to invite the panelists to join here and turn on their video and their audio. Today we have for you, as we transition to the panel component of the session, 4 key leaders from the converter and the recycling community. And what we want to have a discussion around is how converters and other packaging value chain participants are helping address these brand owner sustainability goals in the context of this recycling crisis, which Tamsin just gave us an overview on. So what I'd like to do first is invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves, their company, and I'm going to ask Maite to start.
Great, thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here. Tamsin, that was a great keynote. My name is Maite Quinn, and I'm managing director at Closed Loop Partners, and I co-lead our private equity fund. We're an investment firm and an innovation center focused on building out the circular economy. Our Center for Circular Economy works with leading global companies to solve for like really complex product design, supply chain, and recycling challenges. For example, we're currently working on the Next Gen Cup Challenge and the consortium to reinvent the retail bag. Our investment firm, we invest across multiple asset classes, including venture capital, growth equity, private equity, and project finance. This structure helps provide us like flexibility to generate the best returns and maximize our impact. Our investors include the world's largest retailers and consumer good companies, financial institutions, and family offices. To date, we've invested in over 50 companies. In our private equity fund, was where I spend most of my time. We look at taking controlling interest across the recycling supply chain. Most recently, we acquired the largest private recycling company in Texas called Balcones, and recently merged them with the most highly robotic MRF in the country called Single Stream Recyclers. We're seeking to invest in this company and create the most innovative recycling facilities in the US. And just by way of background quickly, I spent 20 years in the recycling industry. I ran the largest private hauling company and recycling company in New York City, servicing commercial properties, and then went on to work in the largest commingled recycling facility in the US at Sims Municipal Recycling, where I led business development and commodity sales for the organization. Thanks.
Excellent. Lynn?
Sounds good. Thank you. I'm Lynn Dyer. I head up the sustainability initiatives for Pactiv Evergreen, one of the country's largest manufacturers of fresh food and beverage packaging. My guess is you probably haven't heard of Pactiv Evergreen, but my guess would also be that you touch our products every single day, whether it's getting orange juice from a carton or grabbing a cup of coffee on your way to work, or making some eggs at breakfast, or grabbing a steak for dinner. So we make a lot of different products, something like 14,000 SKUs, cups, takeout containers, cartons, meat trays, egg cartons, number of CPG type packaging products. The nice thing about us is that we are material neutral, and so we represent a lot of different material types within our portfolio. Prior to joining Pactiv Evergreen back in 2019, I was president of the Food Service Packaging Institute. I worked at FPI for over 20 years, and that's really where I got started in recycling and composting issues, and got an opportunity to meet a number of the folks on our panel and probably on the call today. So glad to be here.
Excellent. Brian?
Hi, Brian Hankin from Altium Packaging. I head up sustainability here as well as innovation, marketing, and strategy. Been with the company for 4 years. Altium is a converter of rigid plastic in HDPE and PET. We have 64 manufacturing facilities across US and Canada, serving all consumer end markets, and also own Envision, where I got an opportunity to work with Tamsin closely. And Envision is a large recycler, mechanical recycler of HDPE.
Terrific. Sara?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me, and great presentation, Tamsin. Sara Axelrod, Director of Sustainability for North and Central America at Ball Corporation. For those of you who are less familiar with Ball, in its most recent state, we no longer make mason jars, although they are very cute and I have them still in my house. We sold our glass business several years ago, and instead we are the largest aluminum beverage packaging manufacturer in the world. So, everything from the aluminum can that you hold in your hand with your favorite, soda or beer in it, to aluminum bottles, which we're now seeing more ubiquitously for things like water and, energy drinks. And then finally, our most recently launched product, the aluminum cup, which has just started to hit retail and is available online, which is a really exciting product. So excited to be here to talk about sort of our global recycling strategy and everything we're doing on the circularity front.
Excellent. Thank you. So this first set of questions is open to all panelists to jump in on, and I'm going to direct this first one to you, Sara. You know, on Thursday last week, we had a handful of brand owners from HelloFresh, Javi, GSK Consumer Healthcare, Mondelez International, who talked about their evolving 2025 packaging sustainability goals and some of the challenges that they are facing in trying to achieve those goals. And those goals might include things like getting more recycled content, compostable, biodegradable, more reusable, or being able to have them be recycle ready or recyclable. And obviously, for many of these, the infrastructure that is currently in place is a key challenge or enabler in achieving some of these goals. So the question is around, you know, we heard Tamsin's view, but it'd be great to have a dialogue here with this group. What do you see from the converter and recycling view? What the state and the challenges and opportunities are within recycling? How important is the infrastructure to you, and to the extent that you're familiar with it, how does the situation in the US differ from the situation in Europe?
Absolutely. So, you know, I think first and foremost, I would love to direct the audience to a report that we just released, oh my gosh, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, called the 50 States of Recycling. And, you know, to be honest, I love a good pun. And the reason it is called the 50 States of Recycling is because there truly are 50 states of recycling in this country. You know, every state does this differently. We don't have a federal recycling system. And it is, you know, even every municipality and county does this differently. And so when we talk about solutions to some of these challenges, you know, on the infrastructure side, on the policy side, I think the driving force behind the findings of this report that we partnered with Eunomia on are that there isn't a silver bullet solution. And sure, you know, we can look at how states are doing this. And quite frankly, you know, we say the top 10 ranked recycling states in the country. These are certainly states that are doing this better than others in the US, but we all know recycling in the US is pretty abysmal, particularly compared to Europe. And so then there are states that have, so those states certainly have an opportunity to improve. And then the states at the bottom of the list, you know, that's maybe a bigger opportunity to improve. And so what we saw, I think, are a couple things. The first is, you know, we really do need strong policies that incentivize collection. That first and foremost, right, we are just quite simply not collecting enough material in this country. Aluminum cans are a great example, right? Aluminum cans are infinitely recyclable. They have a built-in end market. There's a lot of value in this material, and we recycle 46% of cans in the United States, right? That is money that we are literally setting on fire and sending to a landfill. And so how do we, first of all, work on these policies to collect this material? And then the second piece, and this is the piece of your question, is the infrastructure component. You know, even for us, again, cans, infinitely recyclable, you know, going back to this example, when they go through the recycling system, it should be easy to collect this material. This is sort of the low-hanging fruit, right? And even with cans, we see, you know, losses at the MRF. We see, you know, some of these challenges with infrastructure that, you know, because there hasn't been investment made in some of this infrastructure. And so for us, you know, those two things really go hand in hand. And the states where, you know, we see that there's a lot of, you know, positive momentum are the states that have policies to support it, but also on the infrastructure side, they've made the investment in infrastructure that these things, you know, work together. And, you know, I think it's easy to say when you look at the top 10 states, okay, you know, a bottle bill, for example, a bottle bill certainly incentivizes collection. But then we see several states that have bottle bills that haven't made that same investment on the infrastructure side. And, you know, they're not as successful. And so, you know, I think it's really hard to bifurcate those two things. Instead, you know, really looking at systemic solutions across the industry, across materials.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Sara. And, you know, I would add that, you know, we need to be able to figure out whether it's through legislation to support municipalities to do long-term contracts so that investments could be made. You know, so we see municipalities all over the country having 1-year long contracts. Like, how can someone invest in something like that, right? So, New York City is a great example. They put out 20-year contracts, but we're starting to see more and more of that, like counties coming together to put out those longer term contracts so people can actually make those investments.
I'll echo a point that Tamsin and Sara both made, and it's around collaboration. And it seems like we are not yet collaborating among NGOs and consumer groups, the brands and retailers, the converters, and legislation to come up with long-term solutions that make sense in solving the real problems, as opposed to putting out bans on this or that. So until we address the real problems that Sara and others have talked about around infrastructure and education and recycling, it's going to be hard to solve this problem.
Just to build on that, I would also add that, yes, it's very important for the entire packaging supply chain to come together and collaborate. And, I would say some of the work that the Food Service Packaging Institute, Carton Council, other organizations have done that really bring everyone together. And I will tell you, at least based on the work that I was doing at FPI before I left, the reality is you need end markets for all those materials. So a lot of the activities that we were doing is making sure that there are end markets for these materials. So a perfect example is something like paper cups and pizza boxes. To focus on the paper side, since we've talked a lot about plastics. When we first started our work, there were only a handful of paper mills that would be willing to actually accept bales with paper cups in them. Today, it's over 30 paper mills across the United States and Canada and Mexico that are willing to take that. Pizza boxes. When we first started the project, most people would say pizza boxes are not recyclable. Well, we went out and interviewed a number of paper mills and said, yeah, of course pizza boxes are acceptable. It's a great material. We don't want the pizza, but we want the pizza boxes. So understanding what you can do to help drive and support those end markets, and then everything will flow from there, I would say.
Well, let's take that point around the regulation to a very specific example. Brian, I know you mentioned bans. Another way in which legislation is being enacted is requirements. In September of 2020, there was a bill in California, Bill 793, which mandated that for primarily PET and HDPE bottles to have recycled content in them in order to be able to sell into California. 15% recycled content by 2022, 25% recycled content by 2025, and 50% recycled content by 2030. And there's similar legislation that is proposed in Washington. There's a bill that's potentially targeting thermoformed containers in California. And there does appear to be a lot of momentum behind these requirements for recycled content. Yet when you look at PET recovery rates nationally, building on one of the points that Sara made, it's very low. It's in the order of about 25 to 30%, so substantially lower than that 2030 goal that California has put in place. So as you expect these recycled content requirements to continue to get some traction, how do you expect the supply demand for good quality post-consumer resin to play out over the course of the next 10 years?
Yeah, there's a major crunch. And so you mentioned California 793, and that's now being implemented, if you will. We're working actively with customers to meet those requirements, which goes into effect as early as 2022, as you mentioned. Washington State and New Jersey are the next two that look promising, that look likely. They are even farther reaching in terms of, whereas California addresses beverages, beverage bottles, Washington goes into household and personal care, even dairy, wine, etc. And so now there is a longer time frame to implement Washington, but much more comprehensive in terms of both the amount of PCR required and the categories that are covered. And that's just, Washington, New Jersey are just a couple of examples of probably a dozen other bills in progress, and we're tracking a lot of that. And so that's creating a lot of anxiety and a lot of need to figure out how we can fulfill the demand for PCR. On top of that, you have corporate commitments that we all are quite familiar with, According to McKinsey report, 60% of FMCG companies have increased recyclability or PCR goals. Almost every major CPG company and many major retailers, and so there's a that's driving demand as well. And then we've talked a little bit about the recycling rates, and Sara mentioned 46% for aluminum, which is significantly ahead of HDPE and PET, which hover, as you mentioned, around 30% or just under. So a couple of facts there. According to an industry resource that studies this, our recycling rates in HDPE and PET will need to be more than double, about 61%, in order to meet a 25% PCR target for recycled material in the country. So that's one example. Another report states that we need a CAGR of 35% growth in recycling from 20 to 25 to meet that target. And so what's pretty apparent is there's not enough PCR to go around based on the infrastructure. So what do we do about it? People like Maite and others are investing in new supply opportunities. There'll be opportunities for entrepreneurs. Mechanical and chemical or advanced recycling will probably continue, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about that. But bottom line is, next 10 years, we have a vastly more demand than there is supply, and so we're going to need to figure this out as a market across a number of different ways to meet that demand. No magic bullet, no, as someone said.
It's a multi-pronged approach, right?
Sorry, Maite, what were you saying?
No, I just said it has to be a multi-pronged approach. I mean, in everything, from education to invest, all across the board.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to comment on. AB 478 out in California, the thermoform bill that Jeff mentioned, we're watching closely because a number of the products that we sell are thermoforms. And, we absolutely support use of recycled content. We, are a member of APR's Demand Champions project, but we still have, issues with the bill. So just asking for or mandating PCR doesn't solve the collection issue. And, as Brian rightly pointed out, if you don't have the material, that's really hard to then, put it back into products. So I think, that has to be solved. And to Maite, your point, it has to be a multi-pronged approach. And I think the legislators have to take into reality the technical issues related to PCR. So I know Brian mentioned chemical recycling. That's obviously something that we're paying attention to. Tamsin talked a lot about it during her presentation. But, something as simple as a lot of our customers are asking for and use a lot of polypropylene, a lot of clear polypropylene. As you saw in Tamsin's presentation, you can't get clear polypropylene from mechanically recycled material. So what do you do there? In this bill, for example, in 478, they've included a compostable plastic in there as well. What's a compostable plastic? It's not a recycled plastic. So there's really no way to get that PCR back into that material. So just understanding the realities on the ground is going to be really important as we look at more legislation related to this.
So maybe a follow-on question. We've seen some converters have historically focused on the conversion portion of the value chain, backward vertically integrating into owning either primary or secondary municipal recycling facilities. What's driving that, and do we expect more of that going forward?
I would expect more of that. And as an example, Altium purchased Envision 6 or 7 years ago. Other converters, WestRock, I know is pretty active in the M&A space, securing supply for their customers. And so I think we'll continue to see more of that. It's a little bit more of a land grab. It doesn't solve the fundamental problems of increasing the supply, but it does secure some amount of supply for converters and their customers. And so that vertical integration is happening as we speak. And I don't know, Ball and others are involved in that, but something that definitely we're seeing a lot of, and that we've been a part of.
Yeah, and I wonder, right now I haven't seen that actually go down to collection, but I think it will. I think eventually you'll see people getting your hands on the material, not just from the MRF, but from the collection point of it.
Very interesting. Well, let me direct the next question here to Lynn. And Tamsin talked a little bit about the differences between traditional mechanical recycling and as well as advanced or chemical recycling, and somewhat of the gray area that might sit between. What are the current opportunities, Lynn, in each recycling method? And as you think about and play the next 5 to 10 years here, how do you handicap which wins, or is there not really a winner, but both potentially live as complementary recycling technologies?
Yeah, and I would say it's parallel paths. We are not going to close the recycling gap with just one. It's going to have to be both of them. Mechanical recycling is the known entity, and we still have a lot of room for improvement just on the mechanical recycling, whether it's the infrastructure and recognizing that I think, Tamsin, so what 40% of Americans don't have access to recycling, or better quality recycling, so we don't have the contamination that we have. I think the other thing with mechanical recycling is it's understood and easier to communicate to consumers. Flipping to chemical recycling, tremendous opportunity, tremendous promise, and will help with things like clear polypropylene, and other opportunities. But I think that's going to be a tougher one to really communicate to consumers. When you start talking about things like chemical recycling, you start throwing around terms like mass balance. How does a consumer understand what chemical recycling is, mass balance? And so I think from an education standpoint, it'll be interesting to see how we pivot and whether some of the terms and wording that we use is really kind of more that B2B within the industry discussion versus how do you communicate it directly to a consumer who it just might say, I don't even know what this means. I'm going to put it in the recycling bin and hope for the best. And that's kind of where we've been right now. I think from a standpoint of where we are in the United States versus Europe, in Europe, I would say we're probably a further advance on the chemical recycling, mainly driven by policy, but the US will certainly quickly catch up, I would say.
Any other thoughts on that question, other panelists?
I agree. We obviously Envision is mechanical, as I mentioned, and we process more than 100 million pounds a year, and then make it available to anyone that wants to buy it, including other converters, self-manufacturers, and of course Altium. I think it's both. It's not an either or. I think we'll need both solutions and perhaps others to meet the demands that are being put out there. And so I think we would agree with that. There is an issue, and Tamsin, and I heard this issue on a panel the other day about food grade PCR, and there's even more of a constraint around that. Getting a letter, you have to go through the FDA and get a letter of non-objection to produce food grade PCR, which is a achievable process. We've done it, but it's extra steps in the process that take some time and effort.
Great. Well, let's transition to the next question here. And depending on your role here in the value chain, there are a lot of ways to create value in the context of some of these trends in recycling and sustainable packaging and innovation. Maybe a question for Maite here to start, and then open to others. What are the current attractive pockets of investment within the U.S. recycling landscape?
Yeah, well, we're in a very different time in the recycling industry for sure. I think it's going to look really different 5 to 10 years from now. I think the most attractive pocket for investment, as we've been all saying, is mechanical and advanced recycling. But from my just experience on the mechanical side, I'll speak to that. I think there's a huge, we've been talking a lot about this, but a huge game of catch up to play in this space. Because for so many years, MRFs were like exporting their low quality recycled commodities to China. They weren't investing in technologies to clean up and make good quality bales. because like, quite frankly, I mean, they were getting top dollar. So why would they invest, right? The recycling industry, like as a whole, had a lack of interest. So not much was going on for 30 years, but fast forward to today where we see a whole new world of enthusiasm, energy, and dollars coming into the recycling space. I think we're going to see a huge transformation in the industry, which is super exciting. You know, we were one of the first seed investors in a company called Amp Robotics, which Tamsin was talking about, which specializes in making robots for the MRFs. And then subsequent to that, we have rounds have been led by Sequoia and Google Ventures. So it's just, you know, we're just getting so much more attention to the space. So I'm just excited to see what's going to happen in the future.
I would just echo, you know, Maite, what you said about sort of this up leveling of the entire recycling system, and that there is this incredible need for investment. I mean, one of the things that Ball is looking at, I think many of you on the phone have seen the MRF investment RFP that we put out late last year. You know, we're a couple weeks away from announcing those projects, which is really exciting. And you know, the response that we got from MRFs around the country, honestly, you know, I don't want to say it was shocking, but the number of MRFs, we thought, let me say it a different way, we thought going into this process that we were looking at, you know, how can we help invest in second eddy currents, for example. And what we found was the number of MRFs that came back and said, we're still hand sorting. You know, we need investment in a first eddy current. And that, you know, it was actually a really high percentage that they'd never made these investments and they needed support in which to do so. So really, you know, thinking about, again, up-leveling the whole system. And, you know, Amp Robotics is a company, of course, based here in Colorado, you know, a great company. And there are MRFs that, you know, would tremendously benefit, but they're also, you know, some of the simple low-hanging fruit stuff that's still available. So, you know, really excited to see where this investment comes through sort of across the whole system.
Great. Well, excellent. I'm going to have a couple of questions for each of the individual panelists. The first one, I'm going to start with you, Lynn. So as you mentioned before, Pactiv Evergreen, you may interact with the products every day, and you mentioned you know, both traditional consumer-based food, but also food service as being two of the customer types that Pactiv Evergreen serves. And you mentioned a couple of different formats as well. You know, whether it be fiber, plastic, in some cases, you know, aluminum, a wide range of substrates. And so, you know, kind of a two-pronged question for you, Lynn. One is, how do the sustainability packaging pressures that we've been talking about manifest themselves differently in your traditional grocery food-based customers relative to your food service type customers? And what do you see as the benefit of being as broad as Pactiv Evergreen is in offering consumers or customers, you know, choice, where you carry multiple substrates, multiple forms that could potentially be a suitable solution for a given application?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, the reality is there are different drivers for different industries. So on the food service side, so you think about your cups and straws and takeout containers, litter and marine debris issues have really driven a lot of the activity in that space. You know, just think back to that horrific video of the turtle with the straw up its nose. You know, that really got everyone's attention. And next thing you know, you've got bans on straws or upon request, or frankly, innovation in the industry where you have strawless lid options now. So I think that type of activity on the litter and marine debris space really is driving food service, or it has in the past. It's not on the food packaging. I mean, when's the last time you went to a beach and you saw an egg carton or a margarine tub or something tossed out there? That's not the type of material or product that you would see. So that's not a driver there. But policy is a driver across both, whether it's food service or food packaging. And I think, you know, as we see more legislation that looks at all packaging, like extended producer responsibility, Tamsin mentioned that in her speech, where that's going to really address all packaging. You know, I think certainly the food packaging companies or those brands are going to feel the heat like the food service side as well. I think the other interesting thing is I think the CPG companies have been a little bit further ahead than the food service brands in terms of making very bold, sustainable packaging goals, although certainly the food service industry is catching up. but that's really driving a lot of the discussions and really examining the types of packaging that these companies are using. For Pactiv Evergreen, because we make so many different types of materials and so many different products, you know, for us, it doesn't matter what the material they're looking for because we can help supply them. But in doing that, we collaborate, we have really good discussions, and we want to be seen as the trusted, you know, advisor and informer on some of these things. So when we go in and have conversations with customers and we blow their mind by saying it's a resin identification code and not a recycling code, and they're like, wait, what? Or whether we talk about compostable packaging, that's what we should be discussing, not biodegradable packaging. You know, helping to educate them and making better decisions is ultimately going to help the entire supply chain. And frankly, it helps us keep the customers because they understand, they have better knowledge base to make those discussions or make those decisions.
That's great. Well, good. Let me ask the next question here to Maite. And as you introduced yourself in Closed Loop, 45 different investments with a common circular economy theme over the past couple of years. And you have personally had direct leadership at one of the most advanced recycling facilities in the world, which is just around the New York City area. And you've looked at a lot of businesses outside of that are in this recycling space. So, the question for you, Maite, here is, what are the common characteristics that when you look at a successful business in the recycling sector, what are the common characteristics of why they create value and are as successful relative to others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. In general, what makes companies successful, I think always is a solid management team, right? But in particular for the recycling industry, we're looking for companies that are curious, they're energetic, and they're passionate and creative. You have to think outside the box. It's such an old school industry and you need innovators and leaders. I also think you need people to look who aren't afraid of sharing information with competitors in order to lift the industry as a whole. I think that's extremely important. We're looking for organizations that are not afraid of change and are willing to take a little bit of risk when it comes to trying new things, because the only way we're going to move forward is to try new things. The industry will move forward with innovators, and that's who we want to invest in.
Terrific. Well, let me turn over to Sara here. And Ball Corp, as you've talked about some of these initiatives, Sara, to drive greater collection, particularly of metal beverage cans. And in some cases, I know you mentioned the pilot program to invest in equipment adoption at MRFs earlier in the discussion. We understand that you have a gamification in large event settings to drive collection of aluminum-based cups, including at the Kroenke and Ball Center facilities that are near the Denver area. And then, you also mentioned the policy-based initiatives such as the 50-state, recycling report, which was just published, 2 weeks ago, which is very exciting. When you think about the most effective ways that a converter can drive value or differentiation through a focus on driving collection rates, what programs or initiatives have been successful in your mind?
Yeah, so I think it was Maite who said it needs to be a multi-pronged approach, right? And that is clearly what you've seen Ball do, right? We're being much more active and vocal on the policy side, within the last 18 months. I think seeing some really exciting momentum, both at the state and federal level. And, obviously these pilot programs with the MRFs and of course our relationship with Kroenke Sports and Entertainment, really trying to make collection and recycling, which, let's be honest, is not a fun thing, right? It's not, when you go to a hockey game, the first thing you're thinking about is not, how do I, recycle this can or this cup or, this bottle, but making it part of the fan experience, which has been a really exciting partnership with Kroenke, both at Ball Arena here in Denver and then SoFi in LA and Emirates in London. And all of that is to say, I think first and foremost, the most important thing that we at Ball can do, and as a packaging manufacturer, and I think this is any packaging manufacturer, is the part of the universe that we control is the type of packaging that we are putting out into the world. And the Recycling Partnership has a initiative, the Circularity Council, and it is all about how do we design for circularity? How do we design products that are easily recyclable, that meet this MRF capture rate, that have an assumed percentage of recycled content? What does that design functionality look like? So then when you put it out into the recycling system, it is easily captured, and there are end markets, and it is right. It more easily and more effectively goes through the process. So I think that's the first piece, is really thinking about, first and foremost, how are we designing packaging? And then the second piece really are those policy levers, both at the state and federal level. I think it would be fantastic, right, if we get to a point where we have federal legislation that moves on recycling. Be that, obviously there were recycling provisions as part of Break Free from Plastic, the recycling provisions that now are part of the Clean Futures Act. I think there's again, when we think about investment in infrastructure, it would be fantastic, as we are looking at a federal infrastructure bill, to have some recycling provisions and investment in infrastructure of recycling systems. I think all of those things are great, but even potentially more importantly, what's happening at the state level and how we can encourage the momentum that we're seeing around collection, around these types of investments. I think that is probably the second lever. So the first is, designing for circularity. The second is supporting the momentum on these policy initiatives.
Jeff, can I build on the
Yeah, please.
PCR issue that's come up with a couple times? I think that and there's pending legislation in Washington, New York, and elsewhere on extended producer responsibility. And we as a company don't take a position one way or the other on is it good or bad, but do think about the implications of any legislation. And I think what's important is who pays, and that's still being sort of hashed out, but it looks like it's moving towards the brand owner as the entity, as that producer, the entity responsible for if there is a sort of a tax. TBD, but latest legislation looks that way. But that is a question that needs to be resolved. Two, the mechanics. How does this all work? How is it reported? How is it collected? It's much more complicated than it might seem from the outside. And then three, and this might be most important, how do we ensure that the funds that are collected are directed back to solve these problems that we're talking about today? So it can't be put into a general fund and then and used for other purposes. If we're really going to try to solve these problems, and we're really going to create a tax to do so, then let's be sure that that money is put to good use to solve questions around infrastructure, consumer education, and everything else we're discussing.
I think Brian, it makes a great point. We couldn't agree more, I think, on all of those points.
Excellent. And let's stick with you, Brian, for the last question here. So Altium, which is formerly the Consolidated Container business, has a range of solutions that you've developed to help brand owners achieve these packaging sustainability goals. And one of them, as we've spoken, is the Duralite platform, which provides same or better performance using less resin. As you look at the portfolio of innovative solutions that help to address some of these sustainability challenges at Altium, which ones are you most excited about?
Sure, actually, Sara was just talking about designing for circularity. There's also designing for efficiency. And one thing we've done, we developed this lightweighting platform. Frankly, it's not the sexiest solution. It's not nearly as innovative as for instance, advanced recycling or PHA or PLA, et cetera, biomaterials. It is just good old fashioned lightweighting, but not easier said than done. So we work with our mold manufacturers to create the value proposition. Basically is how do we take significant weight out, about 15 to 20% of the weight out of a package, while maintaining or improving the product performance. And so that's the challenge, and it took us several years to achieve that on sort of the standard dairy water gallon. We've expanded that proposition to canisters, to industrial round gallons, to automotive solutions, to a variety of other packaging forms. And so far we've saved, basically reduced plastic use by about 20 million pounds of virgin plastic resin, at the same time using about 44 million fewer kilowatt hours and 56 million pounds of carbon dioxide reduced. So it's not the sexiest of platforms. Lightweighting, someone referred to it the other day as tactical. I don't know if it's tactical or more so, but it is significant in terms of what we can. I think there's a lot more potential there for us and other converters to continue to think innovatively about the design of the package, and how to improve, maintain and improve performance while just producing it more efficiently and using less resources. So that is one thing we're excited about.
Excellent. Well, terrific. And I've got one last question here, open to the full group. We spent the better part of, or over almost an hour here, talking about the challenges associated with the U.S. recycling infrastructure and the implications on packaging sustainability. As you digest the discussion and think about, your experience, what is the right way to solve the U.S. recycling crisis?
I'll chime in.
I'm sorry, Lynn, go ahead.
So I think from my standpoint, it's acknowledging that we all play a role in solving this. It's not just packaging manufacturers. It's not our customers. It's not the suppliers. It's not just the recyclers or the composters or the legislators or communities and, the consumers. We all play a role in doing this, and, and together we have to do our part. So whether it's, investing, whether it's designing, whether it's, innovating, whether it's adapting or sheer action that's needed, we all play a role. And as long as we acknowledge that we all do that, then we're going to stop finger pointing and say, it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. So I think that's what I would like to see.
Totally. I was just say we have to all work together to get there too.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, right? It's on everyone. There are so many pieces of this puzzle, and we all can advance pieces of those puzzles sort of in our own ways, but doing it collaboratively and making sure that we are all in fact running the same direction towards a more effective system. I think that's the only way to move forward.
Agree wholeheartedly.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree wholeheartedly, and a couple of key things that came up. Investment, we need to continue to invest in things. Not everything's going to work. And so especially when we look at new materials, jury's out what works, what doesn't, but to continue to invest, to innovate, to experiment, to be okay with failure. And I think over that 10-year horizon that you asked about, we can get there, but it's not going to be necessarily an easy road.
And I think it's important also just for industry associations, as we've seen more and more industry associations kind of pop up, that they need to collaborate. And I do my best, I work with ISRI and APR, and I try to kind of put those efforts together because I'd hate us all going down different paths.
Excellent. Well, we also have a couple of questions here from the audience, which I can throw out to the panel, whoever would like to take it. So, a couple of times we've talked about a multi-pronged approach to addressing the supply and demand imbalance, particularly with respect to recycled content. At the same time, there's been, in Tamsin's discussion, the point around 20,000 unique decision makers that sit within individual municipal systems that creates a very fragmented decision-making approach, and a lot of inconsistency that exists from municipality to municipality. So given the fragmented structure of decision-making and the need for a multifaceted type of approach, do you believe that a federal program is required to be able to drive this, or does it need to happen at a more decentralized level to be effective?
I don't think right now we're ready for federal. I don't think we could do it. It's just not possible. I mean, maybe it's something that we could get to, but the investment, you know, it's in so many different levels. You know, just think about like MRFs. They're just different at different, you know, some people don't even have eddy currents, right? Or like they're just picking lines, and other people are more advanced. So it's going to take a long time to get to that point.
I agree with Maite. It's something to aspire to, for sure. I think it makes it easier hypothetically, but something to aspire to, and certainly, you know, the investment needed to make that happen is unbelievably crucial.
I think that, you know, one advantage would be consistency. So the idea of having to work, you know, across 50 different states in the U.S. and 20,000 municipalities, et cetera, is really daunting. I think if there is federal legislation, if they can be humble and open-minded, I know it's a lot to ask for, perhaps learn from what's going on a more local level and the state level, and then collaborate, as we've all talked about, across the whole industry and across all stakeholders, then we could probably come up with you know, what's close to the right answer.
I think it all depends on where there are efficiencies. You know, I think we've talked a lot about EPR, or a bit today about that. The idea of 50 separate PROs to deal with is going to be quite a challenge. So that may be one area where a national solution might be a little bit more palatable than a state-by-state approach.
Excellent. I've got a second question here from the audience. As you look into your crystal ball, 2025, and, you know, even taking that out a bit further to 2035, how do you expect the mix of recyclable packaging made with recycled content, you know, biodegradable, compostable, or reusable packaging to evolve? Where do you see the most amount of opportunity on a long-term time frame between those different approaches to achieving sustainability?
I'm happy to chime in because we make all of those products at this point. You know, I think adding PCR is going to be a bit easier short term, let's say. Something like compostable packaging, we can design compostable packaging, but, you know, it's the infrastructure is really at the beginning. So I think compostable, I would say more long term, but I think at least from our standpoint, customers want that compostable packaging, even if it's going to the landfills today. So designing for right now, but knowing that that end of life solution may not be available for a few years or slowly. So, and then from a recyclable standpoint, you know, I think, you know, we have great guidance out there from groups like APR on how to design plastic packaging. We should all be doing that today, whether the infrastructure is there or not.
Any other thoughts on that one? Well, good. I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you to Tamsin, the keynote here, for, you know, taking the time to have a very thoughtful, thought-provoking discussion. I want to thank everyone for the time. Thank you to those that participated in this session. I will say that the next session, the fourth and final, is this Thursday at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, on the topic of innovation in packaging. So we'll hope to see you all there. There is an opportunity, if you'd like, to join us in the virtual lounge. If you go back to the screen where you joined, and in a couple of minutes, we may have a handful of the panelists and Keynote to be able to answer any questions to the extent that anybody has any additional. So thanks again, everyone, for the time. We really appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.